So our next speaker is Dr. Kelly Thorp, who is a research-focused ag engineer and works for the USDA in the research services area, the Ag Research Services area, based in Arizona in the USA. So as a statistician, my prediction is that Kelly's talk will very much enlighten us on the practicalities of customising robotics and sensors for crop field trials. So please join with me in welcoming Kelly to the stage.
Okay, thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you to the conference committee for the invitation. So I come to you today, yes, from Maricopa, Arizona, where we've had a pretty active field phenomics program since about 2009. I start with a list of my collaborators who have joined in this effort in various ways, and I'd like to highlight in particular Dr. Allison Thompson, who is a cotton breeder that I'm probably working with most closely compared to all the others at this time. Let's see. Okay, so when we talk about field-based high-throughput plant phenotyping, what comes to my mind is the overall effort to take data using sensors, using equipment, using electronics in the field, and then moving that data through a workflow, through a pipeline, in order to make it useful for some kind of genetic application, which I don't know much about that end of the spectrum, but I do know some things about the first part of the spectrum, so I'm going to focus my talk there. I'm going to talk about different platform designs that we're using at our location. I'll talk about how we're making decisions to manage our data. I'll talk about geoprocessing the data in particular. And I'll talk some about how we go about laying out our experimental designs such that we can practically process the data that comes in off our phenomics equipment. So we have a variety of different vehicle programs that we're working on in Maricopa. Our flagship vehicle is this guy up here. It's a high-clearance Lee Agra Avenger tractor, and we've gone through a number of different iterations in high-clearance tractors to this time. We also have a very active now manual cart program that I'll go into. Some of you might be familiar with the Lemnitech Scanalyzer, which has been constructed at our location, and I can see that from my office window. I'm not going to be able to talk about that much today. And we also have an active UAV program that I won't get in too much detail about. So let's talk first about manual carts as a vehicle for field-based phenotyping. We have more than 5 now different designs of manual pushing carts that we've built from a variety of materials, but the common themes are using bicycle wheels for the wheels on the carts and a variety of different frames. In our first iteration, we actually used the full bicycle frame. We've moved away from that now and are just constructing the frames out of by welding square tubing together. And we've built some other carts out of T-slot tubing, which can be purchased from a manufacturer. So the manual carts are kind of a smaller scale of phenotyping vehicle, and we typically only have on there, say, 1 or 2 sensors or one or two sets of sensors positioned by sub-meter accuracy DGPS receivers and logged with Campbell loggers. You can get into one of these things for less than $10,000. And an important point is that for the most part, our entire CART program has been student projects. We've had interns come in and we've put them to the task of designing a cart. They have designed it and built it. They get to use welding equipment, so that's fun. And we end up with a nice vehicle for our program. It's also what we term the gateway drug to HTP. So if you're one of those people that are skeptical, this could be an inexpensive way for you to sort of gain experience with the technologies and introduce HTP into your breeding programs. We also have an effort in automating the carts. So we've added electric motors to the drive wheels in some cases here, and the carts are steered kind of on the same principle as a skid steer loader, where the opposing sides of the cart are independently controlled. So we can use a joystick here to steer the carts through the field that way, and there are a couple of advantages. Number one is that this really minimizes operator fatigue. It gets very hot in Arizona, and in the summertime, it's taxing on your body to be in the field all day. So this is just one way that we can minimize that fatigue. It also is, with the automation, it's easier to maintain constant velocity. So when you're trying to push it, you might speed up, slow down. It's got human error involved. We find that it's really easy to maintain a nice constant movement across the field, and this ultimately ends up in improved data sets because they're nice and controlled in the way that they're collected. Our imaging program is something that we started from our CART platform as an ideal platform for investigating sort of the initial how-tos of incorporating imaging into a phenomics program. We have focused on a variety of different RGB cameras that you can see mounted underneath one of our carts. Light diffusion is important. Images turn out better if the lighting conditions are maintained at a constant level. It eliminates shadows in the images. It eliminates bright spots from direct sun. And ultimately, down the processing chain, having some kind of diffuser on the cart will improve the quality of the images. We focused on generating orthomosaics from our ground-based images, and this descends out of our UAV program. Main application at this point in time is counting plants. So after carts, if you graduate from that effort, you can think about one of these high-clearance tractors. I mentioned our Lee Agra Avenger high-clearance tractor. We've modified it for phenomics purposes by adding a 110-volt auxiliary power system, which provides power for our data loggers, for sensors, and also for additional air conditioning. Because we have lots of equipment that tends to fail in the heat of Arizona, and we deemed this necessary. We're using a National Instruments PXIe data acquisition system on board this rig. We've constructed customized frames on the front to hold the sensors. I'll discuss in the next slide what we call our trimetric sensor array, which are the three main metrics that we're trying to obtain from this equipment. Grand total cost of this rig is $300,000. So our trimetric sensor array, we focus on three main point-based sensors: infrared thermometers for canopy temperature, the sonics, ultrasonic transducers, which give you an idea of distance and can be used to calculate plant height. And we're using crop circle active multispectral radiometers for vegetation index calculations. So those are the three main things. You can see them, the crop circles mounted in the front, and the sonics and IRTs mounted here. Our DAC system is here. And we've also incorporated an inertial measurement unit for measuring the roll, pitch, and yaw of this vehicle. I'll talk about why that's important later. It's for getting the heading of the vehicle for the geoprocessing calculations. Variety of different options for data acquisition. I mentioned on our Avenger tractor, we're using this the National Instruments data acquisition system to handle the high volume of data that's collected by that piece of equipment. Our carts are mainly using Campbell Scientific data loggers, and we have interest in these new inexpensive Raspberry Pi computers and developing those as data loggers. A common theme for all of the types of data loggers is that they have to be programmed. And essentially, we program it to sample the different sensors that are part of the system, and then ultimately write a file that's time-stamped with the data as collected by the sensors, organized in some sort of format. And the formatting of that file is very important for the later steps of geoprocessing, which I'll talk about. And there's need for better ways to standardize this process so that the data collected from field phenomics vehicles can be moved through different pipelines. Let's talk about data management for a minute. If you're new to this, the level of data that can be generated by these vehicles can be overwhelming. That's been the common theme that we've felt in our program and that we've heard others say in terms of trying to get into this, is just, what do I do with all this data? My claim is that planning is key, and we've had to take some time in order to do this effectively. You can't record everything about your field experiment, but if you don't collect the right things or the most important things, then it's kind of maybe a waste of time at the end of the day. So you, in your research program, need to define your goals, and given your resource constraints, need to identify what are the main things that you want to focus on as part of your phenomics collection program. And it may vary, it may be very variable among your different groups in the room. We've moved into using databases, and there are a variety of advantages for using databases to collect all of this information and store it. The primary one, I think, is that it forces the data to move into a pipeline, into a pre-designed, pre-planned, preconceived structure. It forces you to plan, and that's been useful in our work. So part of this conceptualization process involves modeling how your data needs to flow in order to be useful to you at the end of the day. This is a diagram that one of our students came up with to sort of try to conceptualize how we need to be thinking about what happens to the data. For example, you have an operator of a phenomics platform who initiates a run. Then sensors begin to collect data, and GPS receivers collect data, and that's all logged onto a data logger, and a file is stored to a hard drive. You transfer that to a server at some point, and maybe you want to visualize the data. You want to look at it, quality control it, make sure it appears as you expect. You need to do some pre-processing steps, like calculating UTM coordinates from lat-long GPS positions. You need to overlay the points onto a plot map that you've developed, for example, in GIS. Going through this exercise helps you become less overwhelmed, I guess, in terms of how to handle the data that comes in from these vehicles. And it's an iterative process. We've iterated over a number of years to arrive at the current data handling pipeline that we use. In terms of getting the data off the vehicles, it's very simply right now transferring the data to a portable hard drive and then copying that onto our servers. This can take time, maybe an hour per run, per each time that we're out in a day, say. This is the server specs that we are using. We bought a Windows server for about 30 grand. It can store close to 300 terabytes of data. We're adding about 10 terabytes of data per year at this time, and we expect as we get more into LiDAR, into imaging, that number is going to ramp up. So you can see 10 terabytes of data is somewhat overwhelming. In terms of implementing a database, we're trying to focus on open source software so that our methods can be transferred to others. Our ideas can be used by other groups. So this is mostly new in our program now. We're using a PostgreSQL database system with an extension, PostGIS extension, which helps us to handle the spatial aspects of the data that are coming in. And for any programming that needs to happen to operate the database, we rely on Python. The basic process at this point in time is after the logger data is moved from the vehicles to our server, the data is loaded into preparatory staging tables. where some initial processing steps are done. We convert latitude, longitude from the GPS receivers to a planar coordinate system, Universal Transverse Mercator, UTM coordinate system. We calculate unique sensor positions. So we only have one positioning receiver on the machine, and that's the GPS receiver. But the sensors are positioned elsewhere on the machine, and so we must use the information from the GPS receiver along with information about vehicle heading and our knowledge of how the vehicle was designed in terms of the distances between each individual sensor and the GPS receiver to calculate at each time that the sensor is recording data, the position where it was when that data was collected. And that's how we then link each piece of data back to the experimental design that we established in field plots. So the main thing in this data management piece is the importance of planning it out. Our data is backed up. Both we keep the files that the loggers record. We have a backup within the database, in the database tables, and then our IT handles a weekly backup to a tape. Let's now talk about field design and laying out your field study in a way that's going to make it useful for high-throughput phenomics. So the breeders and agronomists in the room are very much aware of conceptualizing an experimental design. You have to consider the number of treatments you want and the dimensions of your plots and how you want to organize them and randomize them, replicate them. If you have border plots or you have check plots in the design, if you have alleyways that aren't sown for some reason, in Arizona we have to consider irrigation. We have to fit all of our field designs to irrigation methods. And each farm will have its own field implements that have to be considered. So I've seen agronomists and breeders use a variety of techniques, not to pick too much, but this is an example of a field design that was laid out in the Microsoft Word table function. So it's a completely randomized block design of cultivar and nitrogen rates. And again, I don't mean to be too critical, but the main point is that for using these high throughput techniques, these kinds of planning strategies are insufficient. So why? Again, I don't want to pick too much. They're great for conceptualizing initially conceptualizing your field, and I encourage you to still do that, to still use these techniques. But at some point, the information has to be transferred to a format that can effectively capture the geospatial nature of your field plots. So these other methods, the plots typically aren't drawn to scale. They have no geospatial information associated with them. Often I see that cartographic paradigms are not followed, so north is not always up and south is not down like we're used to seeing on maps. And ultimately what this means is that you're unable to relate the sensor data to the underlying treatment that was imposed on the Earth's surface in a given location. So I propose geographic information systems as a way to get into learning how to work with geospatial data. There are a couple software available. You're probably familiar with Esri, ArcGIS, which is kind of the comprehensive high-dollar GIS system, but there's also Quantum GIS, which is an open source alternative and can do a lot of the things that Esri can do. For our program in field phenomics, we're constantly using GIS. We use it to prepare our field plot maps in a shapefile format. We use it to intersect sensor data, basically clipping out points that fall within a given plot geospatially on the Earth's surface. And we use it mainly and primarily for data visualization and as a tool for quality control of our data coming in. So this is just an example of creating a plot map in GIS where a common strategy that we would use would be to download a digital ortho photo from the U.S. Department or the U.S. Geological Survey, which essentially provides geographic coordinates for our field site. And once you have that, you can begin laying out polygon shapes of the field plots and where you want to impose them. And then that will become the basis for the processing your HTTP data down the line. There are other ways to get at this requirement. The main steps are to obtain geographic coordinates of your plots somehow, some way, somewhere. And then the second step is to use those coordinates to create a polygon shapefile or some sort of geospatial representation of your plot location on the Earth's surface. Again, I mentioned that in Arizona we're having to fit our field designs to irrigation management methods, and so we're always pre-planning in GIS. That's our way, but I realize in other parts of the world the requirements are different. So options before planting, again, I mentioned the georeferenced orthophoto that could be used. You could also calculate if you had some knowledge of the plot dimensions and maybe corner points for your field. The computer scientists in the room can figure out how to calculate corner points of plots from that. Options after planning, you can go out with your GPS rover and physically measure plot corners. And another one that I like is that you can collect a UAV image, a remote sensing image of your field after emergence, say. You can georeference that image to a orthophoto, and then your plots should be plainly visible from that UAV image, and you can use it to generate field boundary maps for your study. I'll talk about the steps for geoprocessing sensor data at this time, and there are two basic steps that we undertake. Basically, we're combining information from the GPS receivers, information about vehicle heading, and information about the vehicle design, the offset distances between our positioning receiver and the rest of the sensors on the vehicle, to do what we call georeferencing sensor data. This means assigning geospatial coordinates to each piece of data that's recorded at each time by each sensor. And then the second step is to use a function in GIS that we call spatial intersection. And this is essentially comparing the points that come from your georeferenced sensor data points, overlaying them onto the field plot map that you've generated and clipping out the points that fall within certain spatial areas of your plots. So the linkage is kind of demonstrated here. We have a field plot map that gives us some information about cultivars that were planted in a given location, maybe management info if you had water rates or some other thing. And most importantly, the spatial coverage. This is the area on the Earth's surface that this particular polygon represents. That's linked geospatially to the GPS receiver data, which records lat long. And the data loggers are recording timestamps, which can be used to connect the GPS data with the sensor data from each of the sensors on a vehicle. Converting lat long to UTM is an important step. So GPS receivers record information in lat long. It's a unit of degrees. They do so by the triangulation with the satellite system, but also using a model of the Earth's surface called a datum. And in particular, many GPS receivers use the World Geodetic System 1984, WGS 84 datum, in order to calculate positions. But what's a degree? We don't know how far a degree is, and it varies depending on where you are on the Earth's surface. So it's often more practical to convert the data to a two-dimensional map projection. So we use UTM coordinates for that. UTM stands for Universal Transverse Mercator. And we get a nice Cartesian coordinate system that we can work on where the units are meters, and we know what the distance in meters is between points and so forth. Okay, so this is the step that's needed to actually assign geospatial coordinates to the location where the sensor was at each time that it took data. And we need three pieces of information again. We need the GPS position, the vehicle heading, and the fixed distances between the GPS receiver and the sensors. So why do we need all of those? This diagram kind of tries to explain that, where essentially you have a vehicle that's positioned somewhere on the Earth's surface. And you can see that via the coordinate system, if your GPS receiver is the red circle, then these two vehicles are positioned, the GPS receivers will be providing the same result, the same coordinate. But we can see that based on differences in vehicle heading, This one's kind of a due north heading, and this one's more of a northwesterly heading. The sensors, which are the green ovals, are positioned in different locations. So it's very important to use the GPS position along with the heading angle of the vehicle and the distances between the different pieces of equipment to calculate the actual position of each sensor uniquely from the GPS receiver. So in terms of the geoprocessing algorithm, the main steps are to obtain lat-long, heading, and sensor offset information from somewhere. Again, the lat-long comes from your GPS receiver. The heading is ideally measured independently, but it can be calculated from a history of GPS points, although there are some issues with that I'll mention later. And the sensor offsets come from your vehicle design. There's code available online for converting lat-long to UTM coordinates. And then it's basically trig functions that are used to do the coordinate transformation to calculate the position of each sensor independently. This is the same thing in Python code. The trig functions I mentioned are here. So it's using sine and cosine along with the heading angle of the vehicle and the offset distances x and y between the GPS receiver and each sensor to calculate the correction for each sensor. Some pitfalls on this geoprocessing strategy. In terms of navigation, there are two terms that's important to understand the difference. Course, which is the travel direction of the vehicle, and heading, which is defined as the direction that the front of the vehicle, the nose of the vehicle, is pointing. So you can get course from GPS receivers. GPS receivers will output course. That's of course, the travel direction, and it's calculated from a history of recorded points. But in order to do the data transformation that I mentioned, you need heading. That's the measurement that's actually needed. So if you're using course from GPS to do the correction, you can in some cases, but there are some caveats. One issue is with our carts, sometimes we're pushing, sometimes we're pulling based on just practicality of the cart. And so in that case, you may be flipping your course on each pass through the field, whereas the heading of that vehicle would remain fixed. And another condition that we found early on is demonstrated here in this GIS map, where essentially what's happened here is the vehicle has come. This data was collected with 4 sensors along the boom of a tractor. And what's happened here is the tractor has come to a stop. So when the tractor happens to stop for whatever reason in the field, the loggers don't stop. They're still recording data, and so data is still coming in. The problem is that now the GPS receiver is fixed. It's not moving. And so the positions that are coming in have noise associated with them. So if you try to calculate the course, let's see. Calculate the course from a history of points with noise, you're going to get noisy courses. And so if you try to use that as a surrogate for heading, then you get this effect where it looks like the sensor boom is kind of spinning around that fixed point. It's a critical error, very critical error, because what it's in fact doing is positioning points in the wrong plot in that case. So be aware of that. Some solutions, again, I mentioned now we're using inertial measurement units as a way to get at vehicle heading. On our vehicles, you could also think about using a digital compass. And I know some other groups have just installed 2 GPS receivers on each end of a tractor boom. And so you have 2 fixed positions. Now you can effectively calculate a heading from that. This is what we're after at the end of it all. And as an engineer, this is something that I can say I can pass on to the breeder, to the geneticist, as a sort of finished product from the whole operation. So what I'm showing here is essentially a polygon shapefile in GIS. So the polygons represent the plots, the location of plots geospatially. And the points come from, it looks like in this case it was from a crop circle sensor, which was measuring NDVI of the canopy. And you can see that the points, number one, they overlay sort of as we would expect them to. over top of our plots. Now, there are cases where it doesn't do this, and then those are the times when you need to go in and sort of debug and figure out why the processing algorithm has resulted in points that are not laying as you expect. This is part of our quality control endeavor. And what you get then through intersecting points within plots is you're able to link the positioning information for each sensor, each time a piece of data was collected by a sensor, with the actual data that was recorded by the sensor, the NDVI column. And then over there on the far right, barcode. So the barcode information is assigned to the underlying plot. And we can link the two together because we are able to overlay the points appropriately in GIS. The barcode provides some information about the cultivar that was planted at the location where that data was recorded. So this essentially combines all the pieces of information that are necessary for a breeder to make selections based on the data, for genetic computations to happen, and so forth. So in final, in terms of data collection, what I've seen in our group, I've just been really impressed with the creativity, particularly among our students, and how they've creatively tried to come up with cart solutions for phenomics. It's something that's grown up in our program in the last couple years, and it's just great to see students come in and use their creativity to build a tool that is actually very functional for us. In terms of data management, I'd say planning wins. Otherwise, you're overwhelmed. You're just getting data all the time, and you don't know how to make sense of it. And so it comes to be a point where you have to sit down and plan out what you really need and how you're going to make it useful for your program. In terms of the data processing, the geoprocessing steps, meticulousness wins. This is where the computer scientists are useful. I've spent many a time with our techs sitting down and studying a GIS screen and trying to understand why in the world this one point is not where we expect it to be. And then we have to dive back into the code that's doing the geoprocessing and find the bug and fix it. So the people that can really hone in on problems and be meticulous and detailed will succeed there. And then once we get to the point where we can actually analyze the data, then as an engineer, I say, everybody wins now, I've done my job. So thank you for your attention. I hope that was informative for you today.